Podcasting from Portland East to Portland West, from Big Pine Key to Pacific Beach, and from San Juan to Guam, this is All Across America. Mary, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me, Mark.
Well, it's an honor to have you on. This is your first book, Medicine River, A Story of Survival and the Legacy of Indian Boarding Schools. Why did you, the first question is, I guess, what brought you to write it? And you've been a journalist for 25 years and it's coming out now. What was the instigator?
Money.
I love it.
Well, I've been trying to write it for over 25 years, but I was trying to make a living too, journalist. And I would get nibbles occasionally from agents and publishers. But it really wasn't until this business about in Canada of, finding unmarked graves of Native kids that hit the international, media. And then suddenly, the world beat a path to my door. Prior to that, I couldn't get arrested for writing about boarding schools. I was doing that.
Wow.
There was really, it was very little, interest. My husband, the deal we have is, he said, well, you can write a book if it doesn't cost us money for you to do it. So, so I just, like, as I said, I've long wanted to write a book about it, about the experience and about my family. But, I just, I didn't have the resources to do so. So thanks now, it came before I passed away, and blessedly, I did it.
So what happened in Canada? Can you talk more about that?
Yes, Canada had a similar system to the United States. Actually, it was modeled on the United States. They refer to it as residential schools. They are about half as many, actually less than half as many schools as we have in the United States. But they it began like in 2007. They started really taking a look at their past and doing some truth and reconciliation and work. And they also, did some really incredible investigative work looking at the number of schools, the number of children who attended, number of children who died, etc. And actually, the nation apologized to its indigenous peoples and compensated them. Of course, some people say there's never sufficient compensation for such a thing. But they did also, people collected people's stories and experiences and made them available to the public. And I think, I was speaking to Chief Wilton Littlechild, who was a commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for a period. And he said that when they started, oh my gosh, I think it was something like 10% of Canadians had any idea about the residential system. But after they finished, it's over half the people did. So huge impact. So they had, of course, it was no news to Native people that many children at the schools died. It wasn't a secret necessarily at all. Of course, particularly during, the late part of the 19th and early 20th centuries, transportation is not what it is today. And, the children died, they had to do something with the remains. They often didn't have resources to ship them home. So they buried them. And they actually many of the graves lost to time. They're sort of irregular burials where children, buried after some violence or something that, that's always has been the accusation. Perhaps that also did happen, but, there were a lot of children who died and were buried, with very little cost involved in those cemeteries, and burial places often just succumb to time.
And why, and what was what happened to most of these children? How did they die?
The children who died, well, most of the children died from disease and tuberculosis specifically.
Yeah.
Tuberculosis during and in the world and in North America, tuberculosis began really raging, I think, with European immigration and industrialization in the United States in the, again, mid to late 19th century. And oh my gosh, I think I read that there was at one point, there were like 450 people a day who died in the United States, according to the So it was like, basically the diagnosis was a death sentence. And particularly, if you're away from home and, these boarding school environments, unwittingly created these perfect vectors for disease transmission.
Sure. Yeah.
And they would list the causes of death. They used to call it consumption or other sort of terms. Maybe scrofula, which is a terrible. I guess people would develop sores from it. It was really horrible. And so a lot of children succumbed to that, and then also a lot of kids were sent home when they were really, really sick,
which is crazy.
Yeah, and well, at the time, operators and of the boarding schools, it really didn't want that kind of negative press because kids would
Sure.
die like almost immediately. When
Yeah.
Lieutenant Richard Pratt was on kind of the granddad, we consider him kind of the granddaddy of the federal boarding school system, and he began sending children home because he really didn't want to, he didn't want to record those numbers, and he described
Yeah.
it as thinning wheat timber. So he would send them home,
Right.
and not only, of course, would they pass away, in many cases, they would pass along the disease to their family and community.
Yeah.
So there's, like, a lot of work to be done to kind of try to capture the impact, the mortality on Native people. We can look at the dramatic decrease, and the number of lives lost in general in Indian country to tuberculosis.
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, I think that certainly the boarding school experience played a role in that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, yeah. And, in reading the book, I have a five-year-old. My sons are 5 and 7. My youngest is 5. He still sucks his thumb. He's a super cute kid. I cannot imagine sending him to boarding school, like, basically permanent boarding school. Can you describe what happened to your mother, how old she was, and how long she was there?
Well, the other thing that I should, interject is, the boarding school experience was a nuanced experience for Native people, and it differed by decade, really. Early on, I mean, because of, I think, a number of things, including transportation limitations, man, they would ship you off 3,000 miles away. They weren't going to be bringing you back again, and so
Mhm.
it was like it was quite an undertaking. So once you were gone, they kept you away for a period of time. But as things progressed in our society, transportation became more available and people were able to go home perhaps more often. But the classic kind of boarding school experience is, separation from your family and really from your culture and your language, because that was really what it was about. They demonized the culture and languages. That was really what they saw. I think the federal government and people in favor of civilizing Native people, that's really what they saw as the problem, was our culture and language. We could, in their eyes, become servants and maybe adopt trades, but the problem was we were just too Indian. And if they could separate us from that, we would kind of be able to fall in line to the great plan of capitalism and
Yeah.
manifest destiny.
Right. And do you feel like the church was simply an excuse for that manifest destiny? Like, what was the pathology behind why it was done? I mean, do you feel that the nuns had ill intentions? Do you what was your thought in finishing the book and hearing your mother's and stories from other family members? Like, what was the reasoning? What was the justification?
Oh, I'm sure they felt they were doing good. I'm sure the federal government thought they were doing good. I mean, it was like it was a bloodless alternative. The alternative was outright extermination. Uh,
Yeah.
so it was like considered to be, very, very Christian, of doing these, Native people a big favor by civilizing them and saving their lives. I mean, it was seen as an
Mm.
act of, like basically realizing the Great Commission in Christianity, which is to convert everybody to Christianity
Mhm.
and save
Yeah.
their souls, whether they want it or not. And so, I mean, from their perspective, I'm sure, they felt very righteous. My mother always, that was actually one of the things that outright outraged her the most, was this sort of, you know, just this righteousness that these folks had, in the face of a lot of kids really suffering. You've frozen.
Yeah. Yeah. But oh, I'm here. I'm here.
Okay.
All right. Sorry about that. But yeah, let me know if I've ever frozen. What time do we have? 13 minutes after. I'll save it. Boom. I'll edit it out. Sorry about
Okay.
that.
It's okay.
And so your mother held on to her Catholic faith. She was buried. You had a Christian mass for her. Can you tell me about that?
So you're saying that you find that you are unable to really sort of understand that. Is that what you're saying?
Yes and no. I mean, I just interested in hearing how she came about it, what your thoughts are on that, and I mean, clearly she had a very difficult time, but there were parts of the religion that remained important to her.
Well, that was I mean, if you wanted to survive in her world, you embrace Christianity. You embraced, in her case, Catholicism. I mean,
Yeah.
she sent me to Catholic school, and
Right.
I'm the only girl in the family. I'm the youngest, but I was the only person who got sent to not to boarding school, but to Catholic school. I went to a Catholic day school. And in
Yeah.
her mind, I mean, she was providing me with the tools for survival. That I
Yeah.
know this world because if in her mind, if you didn't know this world, know how to exist in it, know the language and the society, you weren't going to do well as a Native woman. So I think
Right.
for her, it was really, that really was the only means for survival and any measure of success. I think she felt tremendously ambivalent about it. But I think, she didn't really, it was just too risky for her to completely turn her back on it.
Right. Right. One of the things that struck me the most was that this term that was used over and over again of dirty Indians. And that really stuck with your mom, it seems like, for much of her life, and can you talk about that?
Yes, I mean, again, with that ambivalence, I mean, I think the nuns, when she was living at the sister school, that's what they called it. It was a St. Mary's Catholic Indian boarding school on the Bed River Reservation in Wisconsin. It was operated by by a Franciscan order of nuns called the Sisters of Perpetual Adoration. And, while they really made a great show of caring for the children, and in some ways, it was my mother was saved from starvation. It was at the time her family had fallen apart and even her extended family really had no means to support her or her
Mhm.
siblings. So they sent them to the sister school, to the boarding school. So I mean, I think in many cases it saved children's lives physically,
Yeah.
but it came with a really big price tag. And I think that, the nuns, they would berate the children, while, being very, very self-righteous. I mean, they would always remind the children, that they were being saved, only from the largesse of the church. And because of their great, magnanimity, mag oh my am I mispronouncing that word?
Magnanimity? Magnanimity? I don't
To
know.
extend to them, extend to them the benefits of civilization, but also reminding them they can never really, they can only occupy a certain level within that sphere. And so that
Yeah.
was always you dirty, ungrateful Indian. But being dirty, my mother really, she was taught to clean, and she really was obsessive about it.
Yeah.
She would, I was really trained to clean the house. And she would tell me, "Get on your purr bones, girl." I mean, you did not mop the floor. We didn't possess such an object in my home. You know, she would do these things on her hands and knees, and she would, scrub the floor and wax it, and then wanted to have to strip the wax off later. And she would just very obsessive about the laundry and so on and ironing. And she would say, I can remember her muttering, "We may be Indian, but by God, we ain't dirty." And she really wanted her house would be a showplace for Christian cleanliness, if you will. But that being said, and she used to use ammonia in her cleaning, which is such a penetrating
Oh,
smell.
terrible. Yeah.
And if I even now get just even a whiff of it, boy, it just sends me back. Particularly
Yeah.
Saturday mornings were her time when she would just tear through the house and clean. But we bonded over cleaning in some ways. Like I have really nice memories of ironing with her. She taught me how to iron. That was when I was very little. I was taught to iron the hankies, the handkerchiefs, my dad, everything was ironed. My dad's undershirts, the pillowcases. But we would listen to the radio and talk and laugh. And I have nice memories of her doing ironing in the afternoons.
Was she somebody during those times that would reveal more about her childhood, or did it take until much later in her life?
No, I was the person she shared it with, and
Yeah.
I don't we can speculate endlessly about why she's no longer here. I think some of it is because I was the youngest and the only girl, and, I think really as I've thought more about it, it was a time in her life when she was safe. We had lived, when I was up until I was, like, maybe about 1 or 2, we lived in kind of a shack, and, my dad then was doing a little better in his business, and we bought an actual house, and two-story house, and on the other side of town, on the edge of a nice neighborhood. And so I think for the first time in her life, she felt that she had reliable access to food and shelter,
Yeah.
and also a husband that was, not brutal to her. I mean,
Yeah.
he treated her, he loved her, you know.
Yeah.
My dad really loved her, and he treated her well with respect, and I think she felt safe enough to really talk about this stuff. And
Right.
she told me about, I call them the sister school stories, and particularly in the evening when I would go to bed, she would lay down with me and visit is what we called it, and she would just tell me these sister school stories, and she had such a wonderful gift to the rhythm of language, and I have wonderful memories of that, even though some of the stories are terribly painful. She, for whatever reason, I was her vessel, and she told me all these.
Yeah. And can you talk about Sister Catherine?
Sister Mary Catherine, yeah, she was kind of the evil stepmother of those stories, which were kind of like these, real life fairy tales framed in that way. She was the mother superior of the school, and she was like, I got into the archives at Marquette University in Milwaukee, which is a Catholic university, and I was able to look at some of the correspondence between Mother Superior Sister Catherine and the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions administrative office at that time in Washington, D.C. And she came across as a very paranoid woman. She was particularly, for instance, she didn't want any intervention by county or state authorities in her school. And these were her Indians or our Indians. She really saw, you know, it was her, unique duty to oversee this community. And she was also very cruel. My mom often talked about her punishments, and she recollected, for instance, like because the children were always hungry. They were really, not very generous with the food. And my mom, that's like her earliest recollection, is being really hungry. And they would like sneak a cup of cream from the milking parlor. They had a working farm at the school. And she also remembered going into the cellar for something, and there was this beautiful apple in crates, and she took it and she stole it and she ate it, and she received just this terrible whipping for stealing this apple. But she refused to cry. She told me, but she just forever savored the taste of that apple.
And in terms of geography, so the Ojibwe, the Bad River Reservation is far northern Wisconsin,
Correct.
and the school was close to the reservation.
Oh, it was on the reservation.
Okay, okay. So,
And
I think a lot of folks and many listeners are familiar maybe with the Carlisle School, and as you said earlier, that, people could come from 1,000 miles or more away, whereas this school was close by, so there were boarders like your mother, but then there were also day students that were also Indian that would come and go every morning and evening.
Yeah, and that was the attraction of the religious schools, especially the Catholic schools. They were built closer to Indian communities or actually on reservations.
Yeah.
And that there's some really long backstory to that, which I don't know necessarily listeners are interested in. But the Catholic Church saw this opportunity, and they actually received federal support, and they received Indian native families could quote unquote choose to send their children to these schools that were closer by. And of course,
Yeah.
that's not much of a choice. You're going to send your kid 3,000 miles away. You're going to send your kid 10 miles away, where you might get an opportunity to see the child occasionally. And so Indians actually paid for their assimilation and their education twice, both with, the treaties when often they, were supposed to receive education in exchange for lands and resources. Then they paid again out of the trust and treaty funds to the Catholic Church, actually to the federal government, and then which then dispensed to the Catholic Church. So, people could quote unquote choose to send their children to these schools that were closer by, so they would, get somewhat of a chance to maintain family. And so people chose to do that. There's many Catholic Indian boarding schools on or close to reservations, and some still exist today.
Yeah, and I think there were at one point 500 of these schools, and now there's still 90. And how were those like, and how were those run differently than they were back in the day?
Well, a lot of them are, they're native people over communities oversee them. There's like, and they,
Okay.
great input into curriculum and so on. There are still some schools that are operated by Christian organizations, just a handful. And I can't name them off the top of my head. And there are still some federal Indian boarding schools operated and funded by the Bureau of Indian Education. But as I said, there's various sort of models, but tribes are quite involved with their operation. However, they're kind of universally underfunded, and People still go. People take There are some families who generations of the family go to the boarding schools, and some of the
Yeah.
schools are felt to be quite good. Others have, like, a sort of a therapeutic element that they offer for children who may be struggling with, you know, behavioral issues or mental health or addiction and so on. However, they don't really have the staffing that they should have, so they can be,
Yeah.
maybe not so welcoming. So there's various, experiences. As I said, it's a nuanced story, and that's something people really want to, especially media. You want a story that's black and white, and all these poor Indians
Right.
suffered, and the white people beat the
Right.
hell out of them, and consistently. And but obviously during this enormous period of time, a lot changed over periods of time, and it's sort of dependent upon when you went to the schools and locations, as I said. So some schools, today, I mean, are arguably some were better funded and staffed than others.
And so what years were what was the, I don't know, the heyday of these schools? When were they operational? I mean, we're dating back to the 1800s.
1870s, really post Civil War, quote unquote, the heyday into the 1920s.
Mhm.
That was, after there was this guy who later became the secretary of, actually, Bureau of Indian Affairs, John Collier, was sort of, there was an era of progressivism, sort of pre-Roosevelt, during the Roosevelt era, when they did this big investigation called the Miriam Report and looked at, actually went out, and there was very little oversight to these schools. Actually went out and visited the schools and saw that they were, terribly understaffed and underfunded. They were, like, often very, very poor, had, poor living conditions, children were underfed and so on. So there was some reform. But really, we sort of think of, really, the quote unquote heyday would be 1870 to 1920.
Okay. And what years was your mother in these schools?
She was there in the 1930s into the 40s until she was like 18. She attended the St. Mary's School on the Bad River Reservation until like 8th grade. And then she went to Flandreau School, which is still in existence today. It's a federal school, it's like a high
Okay.
school.
Wow.
And that's
Okay.
in South Dakota. And she went there for her high school. She graduated from high school. She was, a fact of which she was very proud.
Which you didn't graduate from I mean, you did, but you didn't.
Oh, I did a GED. No, the last grade I finished in school was 8th grade.
Wow, okay. Well, maybe we could talk about your Mary Whitefeather times.
Wow, yeah, yeah. I kinda forgot about that for the time being. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm deep into book 2, so in some ways the book is a distant memory.
Wow, yeah, yeah. So, talk about your teenage years, your time out west, your awakening.
Well, what would you like to ask me?
Well, what how did you change? How did you evolve? How was it leaving the state of Wisconsin, your community?
Well, it was it was a largely white community and pretty insular, and it was not welcoming to me, and I learned that pretty quickly. And I really, really disliked. I liked school a lot until I went to junior high school, and I really did not like that. And I found public high school just to be pretty overtly racist, and I would just walk out. And I would go to I used to go to the library. Oh, the library was my safe place. We had this old fashioned Carnegie library, and all those old Carnegie libraries, and oh my gosh, that was my safe place. And I would just read like crazy. And what's interesting is, those women, mostly it was women, that worked at that library, they never threw me out of there, even though, I mean, they were kinda like, "Aren't you supposed to be in school?"
Right, right.
I'd be like, "Oh, no, I'm doing a special research project or something," I don't know. But they would, there was not the oversight there is today of everything. So
Yeah.
I would just go and I would just read to whatever my curiosity directed me. I remember somehow reading Dante's Inferno and, looking at things wanting to, and I really wanted to learn French because I really wanted to read things like, oh, I had an interest in French literature and French poetry and Baudelaire and so on, Rimbaud. And I remember wanting to, read it in French because it became quite clear to me, oh, this is poetry. I mean, certainly the rhythm of that language is meaningful. So I had a great interest in that. And I also was, this is the time, late 60s, early 70s of, sort of civil rights era. And there was a lot of, in my home, there was a lot of discussion about civil rights and about political developments and, sort of pre-Watergate and so on. And, this is like, the 60s when, people were really rebelling about, against the like more homogeneous kind of institutionalization of America. And we're asking a lot of questions. And so I did too. And I was reading Jack Kerouac, and I was reading the Beats, and I remember reading On the Road and so on, and I decided that I needed to go out and forge my own way and find my own way. And so, I started running away from home, and they put me in jail for a little bit, which was not what I had expected it to be. My brother was incarcerated, and my eldest brother, who I really admired, and he was kind of this rebel without a defined cause at all. But and he was also a very kind of engaging guy, and although he was really a brutal guy as well, but there was something very uh, compelling about him to me. I'm kind of at a loss for words this morning. Sorry. And so I really admired him, and he went to jail. And he had all these jailhouse tattoos, and he had all these really thrilling friends, former, guys who are in penitentiary with him, and they would come around, and I, met them, and there was something, just really exciting about all that. And when I went to jail, I found out it was not really exciting at all. So
Yeah.
boring, and there was nothing to read in there. You know, and except the only thing there was to do is just to kind of quarrel with the other girls, and
Yeah.
so I remember being really the only person who could read very effectively when I was in the school. So in actually when I was in the detention center in Milwaukee for a period of time. So that sort of smashed that illusion. I was not going to be that kind of rebel, but I did eventually took off, and I hitchhiked out west, and it was not an easy thing to have done. I, was assaulted a number of times as a kid, and so I was really young. I was like 14. When I had some really difficult times, but I also had these incredible thrilling experiences. And in those days, one could kind of, I kind of developed, a real street sense of where I could likely find a safe place to sleep, and often it was near college campuses. So I would go there, and would find places to crash. And what was interesting, I would often find the same books at every place I was staying, and they were like the Sunlight Dialogues by John Gardner. I just remember reading. I didn't have a copy of it, but I didn't need to because every place I stayed, there would be a copy of it. So I would just sort of take up where I left off. And there were a lot of sort of, the electric acid test. I was a fan of Thomas' writing, although
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
was kind of a jerk. But I mean, his writing was really fun. So I was reading sort of the literature of the day and just really, involved in that very just experience.
Yeah.
Um, but I eventually came back home, and got a GED, and later went to college.
And when was the shift? Your mother suggested you all introduce yourself as French in school.
Yeah.
And there was this time, I guess, where you tried to hide your identity, and then you really embraced it as Mary Whitefeather. When was there a shift in American culture from wanting to hide one's native identity to putting it at the forefront? And today, of course, there have been all these instances of people who have tried to pass themselves, who are white and trying to pass themselves as native. It's almost become, I don't know, for lack of a better word, cool to be native.
Yeah, well, there's no, it's just sort of a cachet, and
Right.
people can use it to, I don't know, further their careers in some way and make themselves stand out. Well, when I was a kid, yeah, I was told, when they ask you, I remember the nun asked us, told us to go home and ask what ethnicity we were, then come back and report. And my mom says, just tell them you're French, all right? And so I'm like, okay. And they seemed to accept that. I remember there was me and another kid. It was two other kids, Joe and Stephanie. Stephanie, I think she was probably native too. Joe, I think, was Mexican. I forget what he told people, but both, it was interesting. Both Stephanie and I said we were French. And I did one of those 23andMe tests, and not a drop of French. We used to tease my mom and say, "Oh yeah, you're French in your little toe." Um,
Yeah.
anyway, that seemed just, at that time, America was far more insular than it is now,
Yeah.
and, those French people, they're kind of exotic and swarthy, and I don't know, kids seem to accept it. Although I used to get called the N word in school. My lips were, and I look at them now, my lips are totally normal, right? Even looking at you, in the and myself, my reflection in the Zoom call, but as a kid, I covered my mouth for a lot of my childhood because I always got
Yeah.
told I had N-word lips.
Um,
So any kind of, and keep in mind, of course, that, like, as I said, the community I grew up in was not very diverse at all.
yeah.
And then sort of surprisingly, it became, something to aspire to. And I think that was really after Wounded Knee and kind of the hippie era. And people began embracing it. People were looking for, alternatives, spirituality, some alternative to the institutionalized religions. And so being native took on cachet. And suddenly, when I was out hitchhiking around, I was no longer a pariah. All of a sudden, people wanted me. They wanted to be in proximity to me. I was popular, and I was like, I was shocked and you
Yeah.
know, and pleasantly surprised in a lot of ways. And so I took up that name. I don't know. It was the first just came to me, And
Yeah.
I remember one guy saying, I told him, I remember confessing to him, it's not really my name. He says, yeah, it's too perfect. I can.
Right.
But I had a guy I hooked up with, Arnie, and he's older, considerably older. He was like in his late 20s, and so at that time, I think I was like 15. And I remember him first. I think I told him I was 16 or 17, and then I remember later, and well, on here I told him I wasn't really Mary Whitefeather, I wasn't really Mary Pember, and I said, I'm not really 16, I'm 15. And he's like, just stop, because I'm I don't want to know. You're too young.
Yeah.
And he was really quite an interesting person, and I wish I could find out more about him. He died actually shortly after I knew him in California. But he was this, Jewish kid from grew up like in Queens, and his dad was a sports bookie, I think. And so sometimes they would have a lot of money and sometimes they wouldn't. And he also then became a compulsive gambler and ended up, he had a job. I think he worked for an insurance company and he embezzled a lot of money. And so he was arrested and sent to jail, and he was able to construct some sort of a deal. He got out, he was on probation, he was driving a cab for money, but then he began hanging out with hippies and questioning, this whole very kind of conservative Jewish upbringing, and began smoking a lot of weed and dropping acid and so on. And one day he just stepped off and began hitchhiking out west. And I met him on the steps of the Berkeley Student Union, which is where you hung out in Berkeley. And we started hanging out together, and he got really, really sick. And he had a brother in Hollywood, in the Los Angeles area, and the brother Spence was working for this magazine. Actually, it was a music magazine, and he also I think he was somewhat of a pretty successful producer. Actually, he died recently. I looked at his bio. And he worked in this big office building in Hollywood downtown, and so we showed up at his office, and I had, like, some crazy outfit on. I had, like, some beat the heck serape I was wearing wrapped around myself and some headband, and Artie introduced me, and Spence says, "Ah, nice Jewish girl." So Arnie had hepatitis, and Spence had a couple of kids at home, and he had no insurance, and plus he was like a fugitive, and clearly had some mental health problems. So I remember Spence gave Arnie $20 and said, "Go in." I often think, I wonder if Spence probably had terrible regret over that because Arnie,
Sure. Yeah.
after that, a couple months after, really 3 months or so after, he killed himself, and I was gone. Thankfully, I didn't have to witness that. Um,
Yeah.
but I often wonder, what, as I said, I did reach out to the family, but they didn't want to talk to me about it. It was clearly
Yeah.
too painful. But
Yeah.
I don't know. That's just kind of a story from
And
teenage.
you came back, well, I shouldn't say back east, but back to the Midwest and to University of Wisconsin-Madison, and you became a journalist.
That's right. Yeah. Well, I always knew I wanted to write because when I grew up, people were always reading. I was the youngest. They would spell things in front of me when they didn't want me to know what they were saying, and I hated that. I wanted writing was powerful to me. The written word was powerful, and I was determined to have that. I wanted that
Yeah.
power. I often my brothers gave me, like, a little slate and a chalk because I was writing. It was really to deter me from writing my name all over everything, and these I had these symbols I would write all over. I had a black crayon, and I would go underneath the kitchen table, and on the underside, I would look up and I would write things and these symbols, especially when my family was arguing and so on. I sort of felt like it was somehow some sort of medicine or ceremony I was working to try to exercise that. I'm not really sure what I was doing, but I have really, keen memories of pressing my black crayon. So I always knew I would write. And as I said, people in my home were always reading and they were having these impassioned discussions, about social justice and racial justice. So I knew that's what I would do in some form.
Yeah.
So yeah, and writing books kind of seemed, a little bit out of reach for me, and I really didn't know how one would approach such a thing. But journalism, that seemed a little bit more, plausible. So I went to J school.
Okay. And you worked in the mainstream press for a little bit before moving to Indian Country Today News.
Yeah, I worked there a pretty long time. It was like over 15 years.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. And I worked for some large papers and I started out at, a mid-size. I worked at the Green Bay Press Gazette and I had like internships before then. I worked at various papers. I worked at the Kansas City Times, which is no more. I think there is still in the city. It was like an afternoon paper. They used to have afternoon papers,
Right. Right.
remember? And I would come home. Remember the afternoon, I'd come home and see mom and dad sitting reading the paper. So papers, that was powerful, those
Yeah.
newspapers to me in my eyes, because adults would, they would become impassioned after reading them, and so that was always had a big lure for me. And somehow I started reading about when I was a kid. I read about H.L. Mencken, and he was such a smart aleck, and but he was a terrible racist, misogynist person. Of course, he was a product of his day, and very classist and so on. But he was a really good writer, and I mean, he's credited with coining the phrase about what a good journalist does is afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. And that sounded like that was something I wanted to do.
Yeah.
That was a mission in life, and that's what I really wanted to do. So I actually sort of lost the train a little bit of that conversation.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's just interesting hear about more of your mainstream journalism career. What brought you to ICT News?
Let me go back a little bit then to mainstream journalism. So somehow, although I'd always wanted to write, somehow I got diverted into photography. And I was at this little 2-year college extension in Janesville, Wisconsin, and the guy who was um, I guess he was the IT guy, and he just sort of did all of that kind of work. Actually, he was hitting on me, but he wanted me. His name was Dave, and he said, I think you would really like this photography stuff. And I said, man, Dave, I don't have any money for that, and these the equipment is quite expensive, and so on. And he said, well, I think you should come down. So, I did. I went to the photo lab, and he gave me some old camera, some old 35 millimeter. And oh my gosh, it was like that just spoke to me. And what it really spoke to me about was like this was a means of communicating like concentrated words in a story. And I felt that this was, it just, these, like, the extreme close ups, think, Martin Scorsese or something. I mean, I really found the power of this imagery. And so I just embraced it. And so I decided I would be a photojournalist. And so I, did, but fortunately, I also did news writing, which is I'm glad I did that. And I
Yeah.
didn't really have a very good photo J department at that time at the University of Wisconsin, Madison. So I did also some news photography. I did art photography and design, which was actually, in retrospect, was a good plan. So I think in another life, I would have been a designer. So, I got into the newspaper biz and always the idea of storytelling through, these concentrated words of photos. So that was like really, really fun for a long time. And there's like a big adrenaline rush, to being a news photographer if you're chasing spot news and, tearing all over, to a fire or some other like natural disaster. And, that was just, oh my gosh, I got totally addicted to that. But then after a while, I began to really see the limitations, particularly of the newspaper business, which is, very mainstream and it's very much its own little world. And it's as though, I mean, it often gets compared to like healthcare, like hospitals or the military. There's a certain, like, what is really valid news comes in a certain shaped hole, enters the newsroom, enters their awareness. And, really it's kind of about, I felt it really was about institutions talking to each other. It wasn't really about the real world. And I would get turned away when I wanted to do stories about race or things that sort of fell outside of that. And I remember wanting to do a story about something regarding Native issues or Native people. And I still remember the regional editor at the time telling, well, you're Native. And so, therefore we really have concerns that, about your ability to remain objective while telling the story. And I remember asking, well, John, you don't have any concerns about sending these white male reporters over to City Hall, in which the men are primarily white men, the people in leadership. And he says, "Oh, you're a smart ass, get out of here." And became more and more disenchanted with that. And until I felt really kind of ground down. I just felt so walled in by it, and I remember pulling into the parking lot sometimes. The last paper I worked at, I would just have to force myself to go in there. It just became really drudgery, and I thought, I'm not making enough money for this to be drudgery. I need to go. I really want to do what I want to do, and so I just said to hell with it. I just quit. But you know what? I've never looked back. I've never really thought, "Oh, man, I wish I could still be a shooter." They used to call us shooters in those days. "I wish I could still be there covering this particular thing." I never have felt that, actually, although I still continue to shoot, not to the degree that I did, and I still enjoy photography and design, and I integrate it in my work. But, it was absolutely the right move, and I had a child who ended up, we found out, had developmental disability. She was at that time diagnosed with autism, and I was jetting all over the country, hustling around trying to get my photojournalism, independent career going. And it became clear, mom needed to stay home. And at least and I said, yeah, that's what I bet is. And my response is, yes, mom does need to stay home. And I remember in particular one time my daughter she was angry with me for being, even when she was very little, for being gone all the time. And I had bought her a little playhouse with these little plastic family figures inside of it. And I would be cleaning up and I could never find the mother, and we called where's plastic mom? She would be thrown under the couch, you know, she was really mad. So
Wow.
as I began staying home, plastic mom got reintegrated into the family along with me. And so I thought, well, gosh, what am I going to do? So, I just had been I really had not had enough self confidence to write. And even though I have wonderful sometimes colleagues, reporters I would work with, and we would do projects together. And I had a great love for the written word. And so we would, it was there were sometimes, and that would be magic, that collaboration. And so, I mean, what was really good is I had all these great people I could call when I didn't know what to do about certain things, and certain journalistic procedures. So I just went out on a limb and I started writing, and danged if people didn't pay me. And I just kept doing it and became, slowly more successful and got better clients where I could have more fun. And, I knew, and what was good, I learned from, newspaper journalism, it's much better for you to create your own, to pitch your own story idea that's pretty well thought out and, that has sources and so on and a plan, than to let them assign you something, which you're probably going to hate. So
Yeah.
I
Right.
really pretty early learned how to, applied that and have been successful at pitching my own story. So then it became really fun again, and I've been having a whole lot of fun ever since.
That's great. That's amazing. Any stories that you're working on right now, or continual themes throughout your independent journalism career?
Yes, so book 2, I signed a 2-book contract with Random House, and this is about missing and murdered Indigenous people. What I'm looking at now, I have a number of sort of lines of interrogation, I want to look at. And there's like a storyline that has sort of been elusive. And actually a lot of like domestic violence and a lot of violence against Native people, particularly women, is actually Native on Native. And people really don't want to talk about it. often it's just like in the mainstream world, it's embedded, in the political structure, social structure, and it doesn't get reported for a whole lot of reasons. So
Yeah.
I'm looking at particularly, sexual violence in ceremonial spaces and in community spaces, like maybe medicine people or just other, participants in ceremonies assaulting people. And then the reluctance of the community to say anything or to do anything.
Wow.
And I'm really seeing this wave of Native women in particular standing up and saying, we're not going to put up with this anymore. And so people are communities right now are, they're grappling with how do they address this in the community. And these are people who are reluctant to, I don't know, it's just sort of not done, in Native community to, or there's sort of this belief that everybody deserves healing. And in a spiritual ceremonial space, you would not confront anyone. But of course, those sometimes those people's participation, it ends up, one, harming, people who also need healing and may have been their
Yeah.
victims, and they end up dominating the spaces. So it's a complex, thorny issue, which are the kind that I like. And I have talking to some people right now, and there's some these women who do this work. I mean, they are just fearless people. So it's a little scary and it's painful, but it's really exciting.
And how have you seen there's the tribal police versus the regular county sheriffs? What is how has that affected the outcomes of some of these cases?
Well, unfortunately, that's maybe like too complicated for us to delve into
Yeah.
because there's so many various models in Indian country. There are what are called public law 280 states. And then I have to go and explain all that to you. But
Yeah.
no, and then some tribes maintain their own police forces that are independent of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So, and some tribes opt to, they have some some tribes have been able to choose whether they want to. In a public law 280 state, for instance, oh, how to explain it without going too deeply. And basically, the state or the county is in charge of law enforcement, particularly criminal law enforcement on reservations. And then on other reservations, it's the federal government, like and they would also have like a local police department that might be funded in part by the Bureau of Indian Affairs that would take charge, of criminal investigations. So it's enormously complex. They're of course underfunded, undersourced, particularly, on some of the more remote reservations, folks out in the plains and Southwest, these police officers, have to service these enormous areas and, a lot falls through the cracks.
Yeah.
So, and then some of those police, unfortunately, can be kind of corrupt. And often have a very high rate of domestic violence in their ranks and they cover up for each other, and that's across the
Yeah.
board.
Yeah.
That's Indian country and beyond. And that's the thing, Indian country is not immune to any of these sort of human frailties in the world. There's often,
Right.
we tribute sort of these higher ideals, closer to nature, native people, and that they embrace these. We do embrace these tenets. That we are a part. For example, we are a part of, not apart from nature, but we're also just humans. And we are just like everybody else. That's a great leveler, that's being human. And people do nasty things to each other,
Mhm.
and there could be reasons that I think contribute to what goes on in Indian country that could be traced a few steps upstream, to institutional racism. That's one of the naughty phrases now. But I mean, you can't really look at any kind of solution in Indian country without looking at the role that this kind of entrenched institutional racism plays and structure of, for instance, government and and various institutions.
And you talked a lot. You devoted a good section of the book to trauma amongst Indian people and epigenetics. Can you maybe talk a little broadly about that?
One of my hope had been that the book would also speak to non-native people, in families that weren't perfect, which I think is like
Yeah.
most of us.
Yeah.
Um, and then in which we experience not such perfect parenting and maybe sometimes really awful parenting and the impact that had on us. And that actually has been the case. I've had some people who are non-native say, "Oh my gosh, that was my family. Thank you so much for giving me
Wow.
sort of direction, for at least gaining a little authority and understanding about my family." and why
Yeah.
they did what they did. So that has been I have been so pleased by that and encouraged. I want to do something that mattered that would help people. And I think
Yeah.
that has been actually one of the welcome surprises of the book. Well, when I think of, when a population of people, when they're subjected to a lot of the policies and treatment, social treatment that Native people have been subjected to over the generations, which would be separation from family and even having an experience of family when being raised, by these institutional settings with harsh corporal punishment and a punishment for expressing feelings and so on, you don't do so well. And I think that would apply to anybody. That would be your Sicilian family. If they were raised, or generations of Sicilian people have been raised in that way, they probably would develop what we would describe as maladaptive behaviors. You know,
Mhm.
you might,
Yeah.
we might not do so well. So I think, that for instance, one of the reasons I started, writing about boarding schools was to understand my family and to understand my mother, she was a cipher, and she, some of her reactions to things would just be so, you know, unattuned to what was actually happening, and I was just often. I was walking on eggshells as a kid, trying to understand why she was reacting this way, and as I got older, it became I really thought, "I wanna figure this out." This is not just that she's a bad person and has mental health issues. Well, what happened to her? And, of course, that is what trauma is about. I mean,
Yeah.
now trauma, I think, trauma response and informed trauma response is like, "What happened to you?" "Why are you like this?" There's gotta be, "Why are you so," for instance, hyper vigilant and so defensive and so angry and so rage filled in the face of what appears to be nothing. And I found out that those are common responses to unresolved traumatic experiences in our youth. And
Yeah.
that's again for all the humans. And I think that those kinds of things happen to a lot of Native people in boarding schools and in Native communities being raised by these people who were raised in boarding schools. So
Right.
now, is of course, this is again not something I think that applies to all Native people, although most Native people's families are touched in some way by the boarding school experience.
Right.
And it's really a result more of, if you will, boarding schools are really an example of federal assimilationist policies. Again, remember I spoke earlier that the problem with Indians is we were just too Indian. And if they could get rid of our language and our culture, that was, and that was preferable to killing us all off. That was, seen as a more humane way to deal with us. But the fallout from that, was a lot of pain and trauma. So, not surprisingly, people, and then plus there's such, in some communities, such a terrible lack of resources. It's
Yeah.
always sort of this emergency, with, housing and food and so on and safety. So being in those situations, not surprisingly, people will develop maladaptive behaviors. And learning all of that, just kind of the science of trauma, the impact it has on our brain, how our brains, what I've often come to admire is how our bodies really help us. They just, like our brains, our minds, if we are in a situation, in which that we perceive we're going to be harmed. The classic response is fight or flight or fawn, as they say. But at some point, when it becomes clear we're going to die, our brains kind of go offline and they save us and they don't record sometimes those horrible things. And so if we survive it, my mother, for instance, survived this horrible experience as a child when she was 5, this terrible fight between her parents that she witnessed, which no child should ever have had to witness.
Yeah.
She I only found out about, the details about it in speaking to relatives later. But she was what was interesting, she would tell me about that incident over and over again, but she would leave out, the brutality of her father. It didn't record itself on her brain. And
Yeah.
it's like, oh my gosh, this is not entirely just a choice that she is exercising. Her body biologically has helped her to survive in these sort of adaptations. So that just went, it's not like it excused her from being, nasty, or any of us but it does, I think it goes such a long way in helping us understand each other rather than attaching blame and punishment, exercising a little bit of understanding, extending some understanding to each other. I think it go a long way.
Oh, definitely. But did you feel in writing this book that I mean, clearly you understood your mother and your family history. Did was it therapeutic in writing the book and understanding all this?
Yes, very much so. Yeah, and continues, I'm kinda if you I hate certain words I hate because they or not hate, but I they just sort of lose their power, if you will, and their meaning, there's some of the words are really potent, but, it's my path, if you will. It's my path forward is, one, knowing that, it exists. I think knowing that there's a path out of this mess, or whatever you're into, whatever
Yeah.
playing, so on. That's wonderful knowledge. It's such a gift. And it doesn't have to continue. So I know that that exists. And, I can, I can ask for help from others. I can read about stuff and I can pray. Prayer is a tremendous gift. And, whatever one prays to, as I was, I attended AA for Alcoholics Anonymous for a long time. And there's a saying that, your God can be anything you want him or her to be as long as it's not you. As long as and, I mean, just surrendering to the great mystery sometimes into a world greater than yourself
Yeah.
can be really very soothing and helpful and uplifting.
And can you talk about your recovery? You've been sober for 25 years.
Yeah, long
It's
time,
amazing.
I'd say.
Congratulations. Yeah.
Yeah, I have been. Yeah. Every now and then, I don't have the compulsion to drink. Every now and then I'll pass a billboard or something. And of course, I love photography, I love design, and there'll be some really sexy image on there of some kind of new alcoholic beverage and something that looks really sophisticated and fun. And like, oh, what that tastes like. But every now and then, you don't need to know you've tasted many things. Not worth it's not worth it
Yeah.
isn't like I haven't drank everything everywhere, already. So, but it doesn't, I'm really glad to be freed of that. Although it does poke its head up in other ways. Addiction is, let's say I was saying cunning, battling, and powerful. I sometimes it makes me buy way too many shoes and accessories and I mean, it's just sort of that, acquisitive, I think, nature. I don't know. This is sort of my little personal interpretation of life, maybe just me. I think often we want outside, if I can just get the right thing or eat the right thing or smoke the right thing or drink the right thing, I'll feel better. But no, because you're still there, and the new things are fun maybe and you look pretty for a minute. But, I think it's just that realization that, let's say inside job.
Yeah. And well, you save a lot of money not drinking, so feel free to spend it on shoes, right?
Oh, don't let my husband is in there. Oh, no, no, I've there are a couple. I'm no like Manola Blahnik. No, no, no. I mean, I can't.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm sitting here with a broken ankle and foot bone because I
Oh,
was
no.
at a conference and I wore some new shoes that were perhaps a little bit more ambitious than they as
I
far as
see.
stylistically, and I fell off those babies.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, and I broke my so
Oh my goodness.
yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say that shoes are better for your health than alcohol, but depending on the shoes, if you're wearing stilettos,
Yeah, they
watch
weren't
out.
crystals, but they were as I was overreaching myself. Yeah, yeah, it happens. So yeah, addiction, and it's always there.
Yeah.
And actually, there's an old film because I love old films. My mother and I used to bond over these old films, and there's this wonderful old Otto Preminger film called The Man with the Golden Arm. And the writer was such an interesting writer. Tim was on there's that Cormac was that his name? Anyway, it was Frank Sinatra, and Frank Sinatra is a heroin addict, and he gets out of jail, comes home and he's clean, and the guy who's dope peddler says, "Hey, come over and see me." He said, "No, I'm not gonna do that. I'm done." And the dope peddler said, Frank Sinatra was a card dealer. He says, "Dealer, you know, the monkey's always there. Sometimes he's just off in the corner, and that's it. He's always there, and you should never delude yourself. That spirit addiction, it's always there for us, and one has to respect it and recognize it without feeding it to the point that it detracts from us. But yes, I mean, we can never do it ourselves, that it's gone.
Do you still attend meetings?
Sometimes I've kind of gotten off them a little bit kind of after the pandemic. I feel like that doggone pandemic just kind of changed things in a way that was not good. I became perhaps I'm already a little misanthropic and self-absorbed, and it sort of encouraged that. But I still have AA friends, and we still
Yeah, yeah,
I do our traditional ways quite a bit, and those have been very nourishing for me spiritually.
right. And so you have 2 children, you have a husband, 2 children. How has raising your family differed from how your mother raised you, and what things stuck with you and what things were you almost reactionary towards that you had said, "I would never do it that way"?
I sound a lot like my mother. And I know my sister-in-law, even now, all these years later, she's older than me, but I know sometimes she hears my mother's voice, and my mother was a very critical person, particularly of her, 'cause she's non-native. Well, when I was raised around, drunk people, and drunk people were a fact of life. That's just what adults did. There was nothing you could do about it. I mean, they would do these insane things. They would, be in the house, and they would fight, cry, break furniture, and it was just, it was unquestioned. That's what you did. That's what adults did when stuff was too much, they couldn't deal. They would run out of the house and go get drunk off their asses and then come home and wreak havoc. That's what people did. My children were not raised around that, which I had actually somebody staying with me who's a relative, and she had a drinking problem, and she would come home drunk. I think my eldest Rosa was 12. And she said, "What's wrong with her?" She asked me, "Mom, what's wrong with her?" And I said, "She's drunk, honey." She said, "Really?" She'd never oh my god, she'd never been around anybody who's intoxicated. Well, at least, she probably was out in public, but she'd never
Didn't
been
notice it.
had that experience, and that's a singular experience not to have
Yeah,
because it's frightening. It's like, all bets are off when people are intoxicated when you're a kid, when
yeah,
adults are intoxicated, you just get swept along with whatever is happening, and my children have never experienced that.
that's great.
So that's really good.
Yeah,
Pleased about that.
and I presume they've never been on their hands and knees waxing floors?
Getting them to run the vacuum is like
Do you still keep a very neat house?
I do feel better when things are tidy. I really do, and, even at my age, actually, I have these, like I've never really told anybody this, but I have, like, these things that roofers use. I got them at Lowe's. You put on your knees when they do and so I I clean my floor on my hands and knees.
Wow, you still do?
Not all the time. It's not
Yeah,
every time. No, like,
yeah,
maybe
yeah,
every month or so. Because I mean,
yeah,
you feel so righteous afterwards, You've cleaned the house and you've got on your knees and hands and knees, and you can see the floor, it's really close, and
yeah.
it's and then, one feels so righteous and so accomplished. So there is nothing like a clean hardwood floor to me still to
Yes, yes. I mean, there is a bit I'm a very neat person myself, and there's a great satisfaction in keeping things clean and shiny. Not so good with dusting, but other than that, I'm usually pretty good. But I do recommend it's almost like a sitting pad or a kneeling pad. You get them in any hardware store. They're a little bit easier than
Oh, yeah.
the knee pads.
Well, see the knee pads you got freedom because that's your knee.
That's true. Yeah.
No, see those pads are they're too stationary. So I
Yeah.
disagree. But yeah, I still occasionally, I still do that.
Well, anything that we didn't talk about, anything you wanna leave us with?
Mm. Stay tuned for my next book. I think
Yeah,
it's gonna take a lot out of me. It is
yeah,
taking a lot out of me, but I think it'll be important. Like I said, I'm looking at also, the history of how MMIP became a thing, how it became recognized in the broader culture. I mean, there was like a whole long time when, sexual violence against indigenous people was just not even recognized. It was just a fact.
yeah,
Not something one even measured or questioned. The police or, leadership or politics. I mean, it was not recognized as a problem. It was sort of just collateral damage,
yeah.
or economics or whatever is happening. And There's these incredible women, some of them are still alive today, who helped, they helped, write VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act. They helped bring this stuff to the
Uh,
court's attention. And these are people who just, like they started this stuff at their kitchen tables with other women, helping other women. And,
yeah,
in the face of incredible adversity, they have built this movement. And, we don't know what's going to happen here more immediately with our current administration, but all these women, they're used. This is just another. This is another fight. This is
yeah,
certainly not going to deter them. But I'm really excited about about helping to describe that story.
that's great. And you said MMIP?
Correct. Missing and murdered Indigenous people.
Okay, okay. And this is a problem throughout the United States and I presume Canada as well?
Correct. Correct. Very high rates. There's very very high rates of murder of Indigenous people, and then just very high rates of violence that has been ignored for a really long time.
Yeah. And what we talked a little bit about this earlier. I mean, has Canada had a better track record in terms of acknowledging and recognizing these issues than the United States or
Yes. Yeah. But
yeah,
keep in mind, Canada does not have slavery, you know, in
yeah,
as a thing to deal with. And, I think often that just really is, the thing in the corner that, Americans just, because I think if they start acknowledging what they did to Indians, they're going to have to start acknowledging what they did to enslave people and the role enslaved people played in building this country. And if you
yeah,
start talking about any kind of reparation, either physical or just vocal, acknowledgement, you've got to take that into account first. And I think that deters a lot of Americans because once you start opening that up, you know,
yeah. I mean, it makes perfect sense. It sounds super trite, but it is. It's opening up a can of worms the government doesn't want to open.
yes, because oh my gosh, it's just acknowledging all of that.
Yeah,
So yeah, so America is really averse to that. I think
yeah,
the kind of apologies or because then it implies responsibility, beyond
yeah.
land acknowledgments or something, which are particularly egregious to me. But I mean,
Let's talk about that. What are your thoughts on land acknowledgments?
I think white folks feel really good, and institutions and organizations feel really good and righteous standing up and making these declarations, but without any kind of action. I don't think,
Yeah.
yeah, now it's nice if they, I really do. I think at the very least they should pay a native person well to write those things for them.
Mhm.
At least it's a little bit more palatable to me. Somebody has been, has received some kind of reparation for doing that. But, they've become, it's like, well, okay, we're sorry. So let's move on. It's not
Right,
really
right.
followed up by very much action and those
Yeah.
kind of performative things.
And that's exactly what it is, performative social justice, yes, without any meaning behind it or action.
Yeah, I'm not seeing much.
Yeah, yeah,
Some organizations are doing, some kind of land back and so on. Catholic
sure.
Church in particular, owns I was able to find they own a lot of land. A lot of
They do.
that was given to them, that was, native trust and treaty land. They received allotments actually during the allotment period and even post allotment period. They received allotments and they still have them,
Yeah,
kind of, they're very sharp, very good business people. They, they kind of decentralized, and so there's various Catholic entities. Of course, they never want to be one central entity. The Catholic Church. They also say, no, we're very disparate, but that's not true. Nobody ever wants to claim responsibility, but the Catholic entities still own a lot of native land. And they need to give it
yeah,
back.
yeah. The Pope did apologize. Pope Francis did apologize.
He did.
What were your thoughts about that?
Again, you know how much money the Canadian government had to spend to bring that man over? How much it cost them? My word, that money could have been so much better spent. They since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has dissolved, they've really discontinued a lot of the support systems, mental
Uh-huh.
health support systems, and cultural support systems. They could have used that money, you know. I think it would have been better diverted into that, support.
Yeah,
I don't know. I didn't think it was particularly meaningful. Again, it's always the Catholic Church is always, we're sorry, but they always qualify it. They always qualify. I don't know about you. When I was brought up, when you apologized, you apologized.
Yes, yes.
You know, there was no, you didn't equivocate about it. And the
Yeah,
Catholic Church always has to come out on top. They always have to come out, yes, but we're much better than we were well intentioned and we did all this. Look at all the great stuff. Well, we saved your mother from starving to death. You know, what the hell do you
yeah,
want? Right.
yeah,
Um, but they never really want to own it. They are in the end, they are a large institution that is interested in its own ongoing
yes,
survival and hegemony.
yeah,
And that's
yeah,
it. I mean, apart
yeah,
from, and that it is tied to spirituality, that one of the most intimate things in our lives is icky, you know?
yeah.
Yeah. It's so,
And so it's amazing. I mean, I saw in the book how much land they still own. Has there been any thought of, I mean, and of course, the Catholic Church and many churches, I mean, own a lot of land, and that's where a lot of their wealth is.
they're like the second largest landowner in the world. Uh,
Wow.
I don't know. I found about what we think is about 10,000 acres, which is not much in the US. But they also own like mineral rights in various
Right.
places.
Yeah.
The extent, of their holdings have not been revealed. They'll always tell you, "Oh, we really don't know." I've looked at their archives, and I wager they know to the penny and to the acre what they own and what they don't is under their control. So I think, they were very careful documentarians, on all of their doings. So I don't believe that. And they come up with, all of these excuses for not, revealing more information, not sharing things publicly. They do receive a great deal of public money, and which they are happy to do, but they're not very interested in the transparency that would go along with that,
Yeah.
which I think is, it's criminal. They shouldn't be allowed to get away with it.
And how has your journalism been? I mean, have doors been open to you? Have you found in writing this upcoming book that it's been difficult to find sourcing, to find information?
In now, particularly during this administration, yes, it's very difficult. I'm still trying to find out the impact of the big beautiful budget bill. For instance, if the missing and murdered unit is going to be continued within the Bureau of Indian Affairs Police. I still can't figure out, like there's a line item that says how much money is from the Department of Interior is being is being decreased, but there are no line items with it. So I
Specific.
guess we'll
Yeah.
find out at the end of September, at the end of the fiscal
Yeah.
year.
Yeah.
So I still can't, I mean, all these kinds of things have been really more challenging to find out. During the last Trump administration, again, I knew who all the, media affairs people were at the various agencies, but they just wouldn't respond. Now you don't even know who they are. You don't even
Oh,
identify,
right.
find out who the person is to ask.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
if you do, things often just go unanswered. So it's a real challenge this time around. And tribal leaders are afraid to talk because they
Wow.
don't want to attract attention, particularly during these uncertain times. I mean, they have communities that they're in charge of and responsible
Sure.
for providing for. So, they're not particularly interested in attracting, any kind of undue attention from this administration, which is, been a very reactionary, punitive approach to govern.
When is the book scheduled to be released?
You would ask me that after I write it. My hope is, that the end of next year I'll have it finished.
Great.
And then there's the whole extremely painful, copy editing process,
Right, right, right.
fact checking, and which I can't believe I'm doing another book after I went through that. But there's
Torturing yourself.
people
Well,
who
the
I really liked, I wanted to kill later.
yeah.
So it's hard. But, it comes to the territory. So I'm hoping, we'll begin that process at the end of 2026.
Well, this book is Medicine River: A Story of Survival and the Legacy of Indian Boarding Schools. Mary, how can people find out more about you?
Just type my name into Google, I'm all
All
over
right.
busy writing something. Right now I just wrote something about the Enbridge Line 5 reroute around the Bad River Reservation and, legally what's going on with that, with Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and so on. So you can look at my daily work. And then I have a website, mapember.com, not as up to date as it should be, but I'm around. You can find me.
All right. Well, Mary, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for being on the show.
You too. Thanks for having me.
All Across America is produced by me, Marco Vig, in Ridgefield, Connecticut. Visit us on Instagram at All Across America. Check out our website, allacrossamerica.com. There's an interactive map with all our episodes, and there's a Contact Us page where you can send your reactions, guest ideas, and suggestions. So get in touch, stay connected. To me, that's what podcasting is all about. Thanks for listening.